Hello, and welcome to Holocaust Remembrance Around the World, sponsored by the Emil A. and Jenny Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Yeshiva University. In this program, we scour the world to find people who are shaping and reshaping Holocaust education. I'm Paul Kuttner, today's guest host and a master's candidate at the Fish Center. In this episode, we'll be traveling to Le Chambon-sur-Lignon and the surrounding villages of the Plateau Vivarais-Lignon in south-central France. The story of Le Chambon and the Plateau is a beautiful one based in faith and history. It is about how deeply devout Christians of the Reformed Church of France and other smaller Protestant denominations answered the call from pastors André Trocmé and Édouard Theis and the other pastors and elders of the area to provide shelter to persecuted Jews, saving an estimated 3,500 people from the Nazi death machine. The local population, descended from Huguenots, recalled when their ancestors were persecuted under the French kings. Still to this day, the locals sing hymns and other liturgical songs about their history. Over the last 10 years, I have gotten to know this community quite well, from what started as a small pedagogical project to teach my own students about this village. I ended up being the translator of the local museum's permanent exhibit catalog and the 2018 summer exhibit wall text. And I was the researcher and writer of the Conspiracy of Goodness exhibit about this rescue on the plateau at the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center on the campus of Queensborough Community College, CUNY in New York City. It is in fact through this work that I found out about the master's program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the Fish Center at Yeshiva University and how I ended up being your host today. In today's episode, we will hear about the rescue itself from Peter Grose, author of A Good Place to Hide, How One French Community Saved Thousands of Lives During World War II. And then we will speak with Denise Vallat, the deputy mayor of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon for Culture and Tourism, and Floriane Barbier, the manager of the Memorial Museum of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, to discuss how the memory of this story is being preserved and passed on to the next generation. My first guest is Peter Grose, author of A Good Place to Hide. It was published in the United States in 2015. It was published in Australia and in the United Kingdom under the name The Greatest Escape. And he is joining us from Sydney, Australia. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much, Paul. Good to see you.
The first question I have for you is, how did you get into this? You were first a journalist, and then you were in publishing, and then now you are a writer. And so how did you get into this story?
Well, believe it or not, it starts in Sydney, Australia. And a school and university friend called Winton Higgins. People endlessly write to me and say, oh, I've got a subject for you. And they mostly want me to write the biography of their entirely boring grandfather, which I've so far successfully resisted. But Winton's came to me and he said, look, there's this village. I've written about it already. And he lectures in Holocaust studies, or no, genocide studies at a university in Sydney. And he said, this fantastic story about this village that rescued Jews during World War II. And he actually coined the phrase, the moral capital of the world, to describe Le Chambon.
You went to Le Chambon. And
correct.
I'm going to actually share my screen for a second so that people can see where Le Chambon is in relation to France. So this is Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, and you can see where it lay sort of when France was divided. And it's in this green patch up here is what's called the Plateau Vivarais-Lignon, and Le Chambon-sur-Lignon is in the center. And I'm going to also point out that you are here on an island off of France over here. So it was quite the drive, I can imagine, because I too have done this drive. And so what was your first impression?
Well, the first impression was like when you're a kid and you're in the car with your parents and you keep saying, are we there yet? And I kept thinking to myself, are we there yet? As we got endlessly lost. And sort of crashed and banged around the various highways and byways to get to Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. The one thing that you might point out on that map and I'll say this in a way that you can cut it back earlier, you might also point out where Geneva is.
Yes, so Geneva is over here at the Swiss border, right where Lac Léman is sort of borders on France.
Right, and that's terribly important because Le Chambon is about 200 kilometers from Geneva, and that was, of course, and Geneva was in neutral Switzerland, and so it was the target, if you like, for people who were escaping via Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. They would go to Geneva. Some of them went to Spain, but the overwhelming bulk of them went to Switzerland.
And so France got invaded in June of 1940, in May of 1940, and signed an armistice with the Nazis that actually established this divided border that you see in the map that's on the left. And the next day, the day after the signing of this armistice that established the two zones of France, was a Sunday. And can you talk a little bit about what happened on that?
Well, and about a bit over 90% of the people were Protestants there. And they were led by this charismatic and brilliant intellectual figure, André Trocmé, who spoke German fluently, English fluently, French fluently, and a bit of Italian he learned from his wife. And so he led the charge, as it were, and he delivered this incredible sermon from which Pierre Sauvage took a phrase, the weapons of the spirit, in which he said, look, things are going to get rough. We're going to be starving, we're going to be knocked about, we're going to be invaded, we're going to be dominated. And all I'm telling you is, yes, we must resist, but not with arms, because he was a lifelong pacifist. And he said, not with arms, not with guns, not with swords, not with bombs or whatever. He said, we must use the weapons of the spirit with which to respond to this attack. And he said, don't therefore use violence against the occupying Germans, just use the right thing, do the right thing, continue to do what you should do, and you can't go wrong.
And I should say that, and everybody who's watching can see that my background, because of the different filmings in the different times of day that I had to do it from different places, I actually used the church, the Protestant Church of Chambon, as my background. But one of the things that I think is worth noting is that the inscription over the door, literally in stone, says "Aimez-vous les uns les autres," love one another. Yeah. Yeah. And so people who walk in and out of this church every day would see this inscription in all capital letters. And it seems that they took that quite seriously. And so he gave this sermon that you just talked about, and you sort of got the idea that people right away took this seriously. And this is one of my favorite tidbits from your book. I think you got this in an email from Catherine Combé-Cédès when you were writing the book. In the church, you could hear a pin drop. I was only 15 years old, but I clearly remember my mood going from lost and scared to safe and calm. Can you imagine what a sermon like that represented at a moment of fear and despair? To be informed in church that even if the military situation had changed, our source of inspiration had not. It was to follow the footsteps of Jesus and the New Testament. And one of the I suppose one of the things that you and I have discussed about many times, especially when your book was first published, was that this was a deeply religious rescue. This rescue was deeply rooted in the religion of the people of the plateau. And could you comment a little bit more about that?
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And they weren't just simply Protestants. These people were Huguenots. And as such, they'd been persecuted for some 250 years. And they knew what it was like to be hunted down and cornered and trapped. And so they sympathized hugely with the Jews who found themselves in that same situation through no fault of their own. And so they could identify with them. Now, you have to remember that we were describing how hard it is to drive there. This plateau is incredibly remote and fairly inaccessible. And the history of it being avoided by conquering armies goes back as far as the 8th century, when the Saracens tried to invade. And when they came to the Plateau Vivarais-Lignon, this marching column, which went up basically up the Rhone Valley, parted company. That split in two, and it went one went to the right of the plateau and the other went to the left of the plateau, and then they rejoined when they got north of the plateau, and they kept marching north, and they didn't get much further. They got another couple of 100 kilometers. But the history of sanctuary, if you like, of safety on the plateau goes back, I mean, we're talking about 1940, 41, 42, and it goes back, therefore, about 1,200 years. The first thing you have to know, I mean, why did these people take in total strangers and why did they shelter them? Well, they had a history of hospitality, which dated back to the beginning of the 20th century, when there were various holiday homes set up there, basically for children. And the whole idea was that if you lived in some dreadful industrial town not far away, like Saint-Étienne, to name but one, or parts of Lyon, which is not that far away, then people came there, or children came there, to breathe fresh mountain air and to lead a healthy life. And therefore, people were totally used to taking in total strangers. It was not new to them, and they had spare rooms lined up for kids to stay in, and they had barns where people could sleep and things like that. So they simply reactivated their previous hospitality experience, but this time to protect Jews.
And there was also an armed resistance. So Trocmé did say resist with the weapons of the spirit, but we also have evidence of armed resistance in the area. This was actually a point of contention between Trocmé and the locals. There was an interesting member of the resistance who was an American spy, and she ended up in
She's in that picture, top center there.
Right.
She's top center there, Virginia Hall. Yeah, that's her there. Yeah,
a daughter of Baltimore,
right,
which is not far from where I live. And tell us a little bit about her.
Well, she's an extraordinary woman. Let's just start there. And I think the biography of her is ironically called A Woman of No Importance. But she was in fact regarded by the Germans as the most dangerous spy in France, and with some justification, because it wasn't called MI6 then, it was called SOE or something like that. Mm-hmm. But they would endlessly get her advice. They would say, if Virginia Hall says this person is okay, this person is okay. If Virginia Hall says we should go there, we should go there. And she was absolutely an authority on France. She'd lived in the area and she knew a bit about it. Now, she was an extraordinary figure in every possible way. She was a journalist and a good one. I've read some of her writing and it's excellent. She had been a diplomatic attaché, I think, in Turkey, but she was an extraordinary figure. She just is an incredible woman. And she refused afterwards all interviews and all assistance to people who wanted to write her biography. And she said, no, there's too many good friends of mine have died because they talk too much. I won't talk.
There was also, from this picture here, we see there was Jewish resistance in the area. Joseph Bass was from Eastern Europe, and he had immigrated to France, and he actually started a whole network of rescue and also a network of resistance in the area.
Well, the leader of the armed resistance in the area was Jewish. He'd got out by the skin of his teeth from Marseille, and he was called Pierre Fayol. And he later on joined the French army, the regular army, but for a while he ran the resistance in the area, and to some very good effect too.
The rescue could not have been possible without fake papers. And fake papers started with Mireille Philippe at the beginning of the war, but then a very interesting person came along, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about Oscar Rozovsky.
Oscar, yes, I knew Oscar a little bit. He was a lovely guy, but you can see he's that beaky, sort of geeky person in the left-hand picture. Let's just talk about Oscar as a forger first, because I think he was probably the most successful forger of World War II. and he knocked up some 5,000 sets of papers in a 2-year period, which is at a rate of about, I think it works out at 50 a week or 7 a day. And Oscar was not a man to do things by halves. So he didn't just knock you up a cut d'identité or something easy like that. He would give you a wallet full of stuff. So you'd suddenly find parking fines and library cards and Boy Scout memberships and trade union memberships and so on in your wallet, all in your false name. And so if somebody stopped you in the street and said, your papers, monsieur, then you were able to empty this wallet, and a whole snowstorm of fake papers would come out of the wallet. And it was totally convincing. I mean, if you'd been fined under that name, well, that was certainly convincing. So Oscar did pretty well. But the wonderful thing about Oscar was he was prevented from going to university and studying to be a doctor. Basically, when he couldn't be a doctor, when he couldn't go to university and be a doctor, he took a job as a typewriter repairman with the father of a friend at school. And his beat was the local prefecture. Now, anyone who's ever had anything to do with French bureaucracy will know that the prefecture, which represents the central government in the provinces, is the place where you go for your driving license and your permis de séjour and all that stuff, like work permits and so on. And Oscar knew the machines that created these literally inside out. And so he was able to forge things. He knew which brand of typewriter they would normally be typed on. They were typed on Remington uprights. And so if he could lay his hands on a Remington upright, he was away. And he found that school teachers used to do, instead of roneoing, they had a kind of roller on which they would write. And you inked the roller, and then you got a piece of paper and you rolled down it, and the ink was transferred from the roller to the paper, and thus were you able to print, say, 50 copies. And it didn't matter how smeary they were, because the originals, I mean, the genuine stuff would be pretty dodgy at the best of times. And so Oscar was able to create these false documents.
One of the things that I love about his story is where he kept his tools. Because you couldn't just have tools. I mean, if you were caught with these things, I mean, who would have this kind of stamp and who would have this kind of material at the, in the middle of 1943, unless they were making papers?
Yeah.
And so I love the story that maybe you can tell about where his papers,
where he hid the stuff. He was hiding up in a farm, and the guy who was the farmer who was also renting the farm, Héritier, came to him and said, look, I'm a bit worried about all this forgery kit that you've got out there in the shed. We better find a better place to hide it. And so Héritier had, I think it was 14 beehives, of which 2 had been deserted by the resident bees. And so he said, well, let's hide them in the beehives. Well, it must have taken a Gestapo man of more than ordinary courage to stick his hand in a beehive to see if there were any tools for forging stuff in there. And thus Oscar was able to keep the stuff secure and away from prying eyes for a very long time.
These papers were actually quite necessary for escape to Switzerland. And so earlier we saw on the other map where the Chambon was in relation to Geneva, and here we have it clearer. And so a whole bunch of different routes that you see here, the variant of itinerary A, and then you have itinerary A, the regular one that goes through Annecy. You have this one that went through Valence. Walk us through a little bit how Escape to Switzerland took place. I feel like it also involved Boy Scout outfits.
Well, it certainly did. The routes were identified as the southern route and the northern route, cleverly. And the southern route, which went to Annecy, did it go to Annecy? No, it didn't. It went to if you mark it, Paul, yeah, down there. You had to walk the first 70 kilometers, which was a fair way. And so the way they did this was they would disguise the parties of Jews who would try to walk to Switzerland as Boy Scouts. And some of these, and Catherine Conversettis in one of her many, many emails to me, said these guys weren't exactly young. And so what you had was all these middle-aged Jews dressed up as Boy Scouts in their shorts and pointy hats, heading for Switzerland, marching and singing and with hiking sticks as they went along. And I mean, How they weren't discovered, I simply don't know. But somehow they were able to persuade people that they were parties of Boy Scouts and not Jews trying to flee to Switzerland. But the northern route, which I slightly know better, you took the train down to the bottom of the hill, and then you went through Lyon and up through, you could go, the southern one went to Annecy, and then you went up, following Paul's pointer there. And he, the guy who did this a lot was a guy called Pierre Piton. And Piton, I think he led 20 parties of Jews to Geneva before he was finally busted, and that was the end of him. Well, it wasn't the end of him. He went on to join the resistance, but it was the end of his smuggling career. And the wonderful thing is the French word for smuggler is also the same word as for ferryman, passeur. And so he was probably the best passeur in the village of Le Chambon. I mean, 20 successful missions is pretty good going. And they would go up to the southern shores of Lake Geneva, and then cross into Swiss territory. And he Piton was finally busted by a patrol of Italians.
And it's also worth discussing the other villages and the other Protestant groups in Le Chambon. So the black and white photos are the various pastors of the neighboring villages on the plateau. This is Marie Brot in the bottom left, and she is a group of people called Darbyists. She belonged to a group of people called Darbyists, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about Darbyists and their practice during the war.
Well, the Darbyists, they had two things. They were essentially Protestants because they weren't Catholics. So if you weren't a Catholic, you were a Protestant if you were a Christian. And the other thing they believed, they accepted that Jews were God's chosen people. So they were kind of a bit more welcoming than most to Jewish refugees, because if you had God's chosen person in the spare room upstairs, well, then you probably good luck on the house, I should have thought.
The other photos that you see here in the bottom, the other color photos that you see here are
I'm sure nobody recognizes the figure in the blue shirt in the center bottom there.
That was me 9 years ago. But
you haven't aged a day, Paul.
Thank you, Peter. This is Lucienne Verillac. And this is also Lucienne Verillac when I met her with her cousin Henri Ruel. And they lived in the neighboring town of Le Mazet-Saint-Voix. And Lucienne's mother actually received a Medal of the Righteous from Yad Vashem, one of the first people on the plateau. Her mother's name was Lucie Ruel. And her cousin told an interesting story worth repeating here, that his family did not have space to hide people, but they had a farm. And so they would deliver some extra food to the various houses where Jews were being hidden. And that really struck me as an example of how collective this mission really was during the war.
Yeah, it's important to recognize the fact that on the one hand, one of the advantages of Le Chambon and the Plateau Vivarais-Lignon for all of this was that it was a rural community, and there are often food surpluses in rural communities. But also bear in mind that those farmers who had a surplus were under no obligation to give their food away, and they could have sold it for scarce money. But they chose to not do that, but instead give their eggs and their milk and their butter and so on away to support these refugees in the village. That really what we're looking at was mass community action, but nobody organized it. Nobody knew what was going on next door. Nobody talked about it. Nobody did it. It was a conspiracy of goodness, as they say, and it was just extraordinary.
Exactly, and that is how Le Chambon became only one of two places in the world, the only other place being Newland in Holland, to receive a special honor from Yad Vashem. There's a special certificate in the town, well, it used to be in the town hall, and now it's in the Memorial Museum, that acknowledges sort of the collective aspect of this rescue. And so that is the picture that we're seeing on the left. And then this stele is in at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. I think it's also worth saying that when you enter Yad Vashem, the very first tree in the Garden of the Righteous is André and Magda Trocmé. As soon as right before you go down into the passageway into the museum, there's the first tree on the right is André and Magda Trocmé. And I also think it's worth reiterating again how deeply religious the people were in the area. I dug up this letter that I translated, which says, "It has been already 50 years since in great secret here on the plateau in Édouard, we shared our bread and gave asylum to these desperate people. We did not do it for a certificate, nor for a medal, nor for a tree in the garden of the righteous. We simply applied God's word according to Isaiah 58:7. How glorious it is to help one's neighbor." And that is from Marie Brott, whom we saw in one of the preceding slides. 58:7 is the verse of feeding the hungry and clothing the naked. And so this is very much how the locals lived their lives. Pastor Trocmé did not particularly want to be recognized himself alone. And as we can see, I won't read it, but the top quote comes from André Trocmé in 1971. One of the things that I think is also extraordinary is that people can do very extraordinary things and not think that they've done anything particularly extraordinary. You would look at the people in Le Chambon who did not want to talk about this for 40 years. It wasn't until the 80s that people really started talking about this because they thought it was just sort of daily life. It was the war. And I think the best quote that sort of captures what happened in Le Chambon is from Simone Weil, herself a Holocaust survivor, and she was in the French political scene for many years. She said, "The righteous thought they had simply lived through history. In fact, they wrote it." Well, Peter Grose, the author of A Good Place to Hide, thank you very much for joining us today from your travels in Sydney, and looking forward to seeing you soon back in Saint-Pierre d'Orléans.
Okay, Paul, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Denise Vallat has been the deputy mayor of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon since 2014. She has been in charge of culture and tourism, among other things. She's also the first vice president of the Communauté des Communes, a conglomerate of the region's villages. She also, in her own right, was a history teacher. She taught at the Lycée Français de New York in New York City. She also taught in Reims, Strasbourg, and Paris. And her husband was, among other things, the headmaster of the Lycée Français de New York. Today, she lives in Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, and it is actually her husband, Joël's family, who had a house in Le Chambon. They have owned their house, which is a former guest house in the village, for around 45 years. And it turns out that this house actually was used as a facility for classrooms for the École Nouvelle Sévenode during the war. On their own block, on the street where they live, many Jews were housed, including a pianist and a child. Madame Vallat, c'est un plaisir de vous accueillir ici, dans notre épisode. Et ma première question concerne un petit peu la date de l'ouverture du lieu de mémoire. Le lieu de mémoire a ouvert ses portes en 2013, soit 69 ans après la libération. Pourquoi cela a pris autant de temps pour que ce projet réussisse?
La première raison, elle est très simple, c'est que pendant plus de 30 ans, personne ici n'a parlé de cette histoire, ni les personnes qui avaient accueilli des réfugiés juifs, ni les réfugiés juifs qui avaient gardé des contacts avec le Chambon. Et il a fallu, d'une part, le film de Pierre Sauvage des armes de l'esprit pour que cette histoire commence vraiment à sortir, et également le livre de Philippe Ali, dont j'ai oublié le titre, mais qui a été...
En français, ça s'appelle Le sang des innocents.
Voilà, le sang des innocents, et en
anglais,
anglais,
c'est Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed.
Voilà. Et donc, c'est seulement à partir de ce moment-là que la question s'est posée de peut-être avoir un lieu où l'on pourrait raconter cette histoire. Alors, très vite, il y a eu l'opposition des personnes qui avaient été des acteurs de cette histoire et qui étaient toujours vivants et qui ne voulaient absolument pas de musée, dans la mesure où, disait-il, nous ne sommes pas des héros, nous n'avons pas besoin d'un musée. Pourtant, en 1983, il y a une association juive new-yorkaise qui attribuait ce que l'on appelait, je crois, le Joseph Price. Il y a eu un article dans le New York Times d'ailleurs, et qui a donné 10 000 $ pour la construction du musée. Mais à cette époque, il était absolument hors de question de construire un musée. L'idée est venue un peu plus tard et il y a eu environ une quinzaine de projets avant le projet définitif. Alors, quelles sont les raisons pour lesquelles ces projets n'ont pas fonctionné? C'est tout d'abord parce qu'il y avait toujours l'opposition des rares témoins, mais aussi après de leurs descendants. Il y avait aussi la question de savoir où mettre le musée. Est-ce qu'on le mettait au Chambon-sur-Lignon? Est-ce qu'on le mettait dans un autre village? Ce n'est pas parce que ce sont des justes parmi les nations que tout le monde s'entend très bien et que sur la question de la mémoire, tout le monde est d'accord. Donc, il y a eu cette petite querelle. Et il y a eu aussi la question financière, c'est-à-dire comment va-t-on financer ce musée? Le résultat, c'est que d'année en année, le projet a été reporté. Au début des années 2000, il y a eu un projet de musée qui était très avancé. Et il aurait dû normalement ouvrir, mais à la dernière minute, pour des raisons financières, le projet n'a pas pu être lancé. Et surtout à cause de l'opposition d'autres villages. Donc en 2008, quand Eliane Wauquiez-Motte est devenue maire du Chambon-sur-Lignon, elle a considéré qu'il fallait absolument qu'un musée soit construit. Pour elle et pour un certain nombre de personnes, il y avait des raisons très simples. C'est que la plupart des témoins étaient en train de disparaître et qu'il n'y aurait plus personne pour raconter cette histoire. Et la deuxième raison, c'est que c'était une histoire suffisamment importante pour qu'elle doive être transmise je dirais, aux jeunes générations. Et à partir de là, elle a remué, comme on dit en français, ciel et terre pour construire le musée. Et effectivement, le musée est ouvert en 2013. Ça ne veut pas dire qu'il n'y avait plus d'opposants à l'idée d'un musée, mais il y a eu un consensus petit à petit qui s'est mis en place. Et ce qui montre que c'était tout de même une question très délicate, c'est que quand il s'est agi de donner un nom au musée, eh bien, on ne lui a pas donné de nom. On a choisi en français le terme le plus neutre qui soit, lieu de mémoire. C'était un peu en référence au travail de Pierre Nora, qui est un grand historien français. Donc, lieu de mémoire, c'est très neutre et c'est comme ça que le musée s'est mis à exister.
Aujourd'hui au Chambon, comme vous avez dit tout à l'heure, il y avait des gens qui ne voulaient pas parler, mais cette histoire aujourd'hui joue toujours un rôle. Il y a le CADA, le centre d'accueil de demandeurs d'asile, et comme dans votre bio que j'ai présenté, on sait toujours quelle maison a accueilli telle ou telle personne et quelles maisons ont servi comme salle de classe. Alors, comment est-ce que la commune et aussi le plateau Vivarais-Lignon globalement, comment est-ce qu'on vit cette histoire aujourd'hui?
C'est une histoire qui est connue, C'est une histoire que beaucoup partagent. On a encore eu l'occasion de le voir avec l'histoire d'L.D.H.P, qui est cet enfant qui avait été recueilli au Chambon avec son père et sa mère et qui a laissé sa fortune à la commune du Chambon l'année dernière. Mais en même temps, c'est quelque chose dont on ne veut pas se vanter. Et ça, c'est quelque chose qui est très, très important. Il est hors de question de se mettre en avant. Maintenant, les langues se délient. On va dire, mon grand-père, mon oncle, ma tante ont caché des justes. Il m'est arrivé de me retrouver dans l'ascenseur du lieu de mémoire il y a 3 ans et d'avoir une vieille dame qui est là avec son fils et sa fille en visite. Et tout d'un coup, elle se tourne vers son fils et elle lui dit, tu sais, ton grand-père Auguste a caché des juifs. Et son fils ouvre des grands yeux en disant, mais pourquoi tu ne me l'as jamais dit? Elle dit, oh, c'est comme ça. Voilà. Donc ça, c'est un point important. L'idée d'accueil reste très forte au Chambon. Le CADA, c'est-à-dire le centre d'aide et d'accueil pour les demandeurs d'asile, il y en a dans beaucoup d'autres endroits, hein. Le Chambon n'a pas le privilège d'avoir un CADA. Mais l'idée d'accueil reste encore très forte dans une grande partie de la population. On l'a vu encore ces derniers temps, dans la mesure où quand il s'est agi d'accueillir des réfugiés ukrainiens, c'est le Chambon et le village voisin du Mazet, qui sont les 2 villages les plus protestants, qui immédiatement, tout naturellement, se sont portés à leur secours. Et quand je dis le village, ce sont des personnes, c'est la municipalité, mais ça s'est fait tout naturellement. Les gens ne se sont pas posés de questions. Et surtout, beaucoup n'aiment pas que l'on mette en avant le fait que leurs parents, leurs grands-parents ont sauvé, parce qu'ils raisonnent exactement de la même manière pour dire, mais c'était normal, il y a d'autres endroits où on l'a fait, il y a d'autres personnes qui l'ont fait.
Vous avez parlé tout à l'heure d'Éric Schwamm, cet ancien réfugié juif qui est mort l'année dernière, je crois, ou l'année avant.
28 décembre 2020.
D'accord. Et il a légué toute sa fortune à la commune. Qu'est-ce que la commune prévoit faire avec ces nouvelles ressources que j'imagine vous ne comptiez pas avoir avant que son testament ait été lu?
Voilà, ça a d'abord été une surprise. Et la première chose qui nous est venue à l'esprit, ça n'est pas l'argent, c'était d'abord de savoir qui était cette personne. Alors, c'était un vieux monsieur qui est mort à 90 ans et qui est très, très discret, qui n'a jamais raconté son histoire. Il ne serait peut-être pas très content maintenant que l'on ait raconté son histoire et que des journalistes du monde entier soient venus ici pour poser des questions le concernant. D'ailleurs, nous, nous n'avons pas compris pourquoi cette histoire a fait le tour du monde. Et la première chose que nous avons souhaité faire, c'était de le connaître, avoir le récit de sa vie. Et donc, nous avons fait des recherches et monté une exposition pour savoir qui il était. Dans son testament, il indique que ce n'est pas une obligation, mais il suggère que son argent soit utilisé pour les jeunes, car il remercie les habitants de la commune pour leur aide dans le domaine éducatif, non pas parce qu'il a été sauvé, mais parce que cela lui a permis de refaire des études. Entre l'âge de 9 ans et de 13 ans, il n'est pas allé à l'école, il a fui l'Autriche, il est passé par la Belgique, il a fui en France, il a été interné dans les camps de Gurs et de Rivesaltes. Et c'est seulement quand il est arrivé au Chambon en février 1943 qu'il a pu reprendre des études. Et histoire rare, c'est qu'il est resté après la guerre avec ses parents et il n'est pas rentré en Autriche et il a passé son baccalauréat en 1949 et il a voulu faire des études de pharmacie à l'université de Lyon, qui est la ville la plus proche. Donc, l'utilisation de l'argent, ce n'est pas notre préoccupation première. On va l'utiliser, mais nous réfléchissons à la manière dont nous allons l'utiliser. Est-ce que ça sera pour donner des coups de pouce à des jeunes qui veulent démarrer dans la vie, des bourses pour ceux qui font des études, peut-être effectivement aussi comment dire, participer au financement d'équipements pour des jeunes, y compris ludiques, parce que pour lui, tout compte, hein. Il met aussi la dimension sportive, par exemple. Donc, mais on n'est pas pressé.
Et Denise Vallat, adjointe au maire du Chambon-sur-Lignon, je vous remercie infiniment d'avoir participé à notre interview aujourd'hui.
Eh bien, merci beaucoup et merci de s'intéresser encore à notre village et à sa petite histoire.
C'est un grand plaisir. My next guest is Floriane Barbier. She is the manager of the Lieu de Mémoire, the Memorial Museum in Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. And she has been at the Memorial Museum since 2013. Floriane, bonjour.
Bonjour.
Et donc, ma première question que j'ai pour vous, c'est quel type de visiteur vient au lieu de mémoire?
Alors, on a plusieurs types de visiteurs différents. Alors, notamment un fort public scolaire, qui est, je dirais, l'un de nos publics principaux. Et on a également un très fort public de touristes sur la saison estivale, principalement entre les mois de juin et septembre. Et cette saison estivale est en partie donc, des touristes venant sur le territoire et aussi une grosse partie de résidents secondaires, puisque au Chambon, il y a un phénomène de résidence secondaire qui fait que une partie de nos publics sur cette période, et notamment sur des événements culturels, sont des résidents secondaires.
Et en parlant des groupes scolaires, quel type de pédagogie est-ce que le lieu de mémoire offre aux groupes scolaires justement pour la transmission de cette histoire et pour la transmission du mémoire?
Alors, pour le public scolaire, l'idée principale est de correspondre en fait aux attentes de l'éducation nationale et notamment des programmes. Donc, l'équipe du jeu de mémoire est renforcée de ce qu'on appelle un professeur relais, c'est-à-dire une enseignante d'histoire-géographie qui est mise à disposition par l'éducation nationale un jour par semaine pour concevoir les actions à destination des scolaires. Ce qui permet d'avoir des actions adaptées aux âges et aux niveaux et également au programme et donc aux attentes des enseignants vis-à-vis de leur visite au lieu de mémoire. La pédagogie vraiment ensuite sur place, nous on la conçoit comme étant quelque chose le plus possible de participatif pour les élèves. On n'est pas du tout dans l'enseignement direct, je dirais, voilà, on parle et les élèves nous écoutent, mais on essaye un maximum que les élèves soient acteurs en fait de leur découverte, avec des activités où on les invite vraiment à travailler sur des documents, sur le musée lui-même, pour qu'ils puissent s'approprier le plus pédagogiquement possible le contenu qui leur est présenté.
Dans le passé, vous aviez un survivant et parfois des survivants qui venaient aussi animer des ateliers, n'est-ce pas?
Sur la saison estivale, on a déjà proposé des rencontres avec effectivement des témoins, que ce soit des rencontres un peu sous forme de conférences ou alors des visites guidées, ce qu'on proposait beaucoup sur la période estivale, des visites guidées à deux voix, en fait, un ancien enfant caché et une médiatrice, des visites qui avaient lieu avec Maxime Friedenberg.
Et justement, j'ai une question là-dessus parce que le lieu de mémoire a récemment perdu un grand partenaire en la personne de Maxime Friedenberg, un survivant du plateau. Et comment est-ce que cette perte renforce la mission du lieu de mémoire et quelles adaptations sont nécessaires pour en promouvoir la mission en vue de la disparition des survivants?
Alors, je dirais que cette perte, en fait, elle illustre un phénomène qui, de toute façon, existe depuis maintenant plusieurs années et même déjà, en fait, au moment où le lieu de mémoire a été créé, puisqu'en 2013, déjà, les derniers témoins, on se rendait compte qu'ils disparaissaient progressivement. Donc, c'est un questionnement qui existe depuis le départ. Comment continuer déjà je dirais en continuant le travail autour du parcours permanent, donc de présentation de l'histoire locale. Et puis, je pense aussi la salle des témoignages qui est présente au lieu de mémoire, qui, à mon avis, a toute sa place et doit avoir toute sa place de plus en plus par la suite, parce qu'elle permet de conserver en fait les témoignages de ces personnes qui ont connu la période. Je dis toujours à nos publics que nous, on peut leur apporter le contenu scientifique, historique, les connaissances liées à cette histoire, mais par contre, la mémoire et je dirais aussi les émotions, les ressentis des personnes, c'est beaucoup plus difficile pour nous de les transmettre. Et donc, je pense que par des vidéos, par du travail sur des témoignages qui parfois aussi étaient écrits, c'est peut-être ces moyens-là qui nous permettront de continuer à transmettre la parole de ces témoins.
Il y a un nouveau partenariat, si je ne me trompe pas, avec le mémorial de la Shoah à Paris. Comment est-ce que cela change un peu la vie du musée et un petit peu l'avenir de ce devoir de se souvenir?
Alors, on est vraiment au-delà d'un simple partenariat, puisque en fait, le mémorial de la Shoah à Paris a vraiment repris la gestion du lieu de mémoire. Donc, c'est vraiment une gestion qui est maintenant assurée par le mémorial de la Shoah, alors qui permet, je dirais, forcément d'avoir une échelle de réflexion et aussi de communication plus importante. Une gestion communale comme on l'avait jusqu'en 2020 pouvait avoir ses limites en termes de visibilité, de fonctionnement, alors que le mémorial de la Shoah est quand même la structure en France principale vis-à-vis de cette histoire de la Shoah. Et je pense qu'au sein de ce travail, le lieu de mémoire a toute sa place, aussi par la particularité de l'histoire qu'il met en avant, qui est l'histoire plutôt du sauvetage, et qui... c'est pas qu'il n'était pas du tout mis en avant au mémorial de la Shoah jusque-là, mais en tout cas, il n'avait peut-être pas la place qu'on lui donne au lieu de mémoire. Et donc, je pense que finalement, le mémorial de la Shoah, c'est vraiment un plus pour le lieu de mémoire, mais le lieu de mémoire apporte aussi sa spécificité à cette structure, je pense.
Floriane Barbier, responsable du lieu de mémoire, merci beaucoup d'avoir participé à notre interview.
Merci, Paul.
Et à bientôt.
À bientôt.
I'd like to take a moment in closing to thank a number of people who made today's program possible. First, to the Fish Center Director, Dr. Shai Pilnick, and to our Program Coordinator, Hodaya Blau. Additionally, many thanks to Lois Roman, the producer of this program, and of course to our guests, Peter Grose, Denise Vallat, and Floriane Barbier.
Our primary mission at the Fish Center at Yeshiva University is bestowing a master's degree for students interested in Holocaust and genocide studies. We have a short video clip about that now.
If there's truth to the saying that history repeats itself, then Holocaust remembrance and the study of genocide is not only a vital part of history, but also a crucial warning for the future.
Confronting Holocaust deniers and distorters is one of the most important tasks of our generation.
The Fish Center at Yeshiva University was founded with this mission of preserving the history of the Holocaust as well as more recent genocides. Our master's program offers a unique investigation of the Holocaust of European Jewry with an interdisciplinary approach through the lenses of law, social work, history, theology, education, literature, and political science. If this sounds like a path you would like to pursue, apply now or learn more. I'd like to extend an invitation for you to join us and become a member of our growing community of scholars and educators.
Thank you to all of our community partners, the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center in White Plains, the Center for Holocaust Education of East Valley JCC in Arizona, 3GNY, the Florida Holocaust Museum, the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs at Yeshiva University, Shadowlight, Manhattan College Holocaust Genocide and Interfaith Education Center, the San Antonio Holocaust Museum, SOSUA 75, Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, 2 programs at the University of Miami, the Illinois Holocaust Museum, the Holocaust Education Center in Fukuyama, Japan, the Sister Rose Thering Fund for Education in Jewish Christian Studies, Lake District Holocaust Project, Jewish Gen, the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center, and the Holocaust Education Resource Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.